I was 23 and juggling college with a part-time job at my parents' little diner on the edge of town. We served a modest menu, mostly takeout orders, and on slow nights, the place felt almost empty, a perfect backdrop for quiet reflection, or so I thought. With finals looming, I had agreed to cover mostly the late shifts, arriving after dinner service to clean up and lock the doors. It was mid-January, the kind of night when the chill in the air makes every shadow seem more ominous. About an hour into my shift one night, while wiping down the front windows, I noticed a dark, matte black SUV parked in the far corner of our tiny lot. Our diner stood alone on a quiet street, so it was unusual for anyone to pull up unless they were a regular customer. The SUV's windows were heavily tinted, and its engine hummed softly, as if it were idling on purpose. I tried to brush off the uneasy feeling, thinking maybe someone had just parked temporarily and forgotten to move on. But 2 nights later, as I was finishing up cleaning, the same SUV rolled in. This time, it glided slowly to a stop right behind the diner, its presence too deliberate to be a mere coincidence. I peeked out from behind the counter, a little faster than usual. The vehicle's low profile and silent approach made it seem like it was waiting for someone. I double-checked the lock on the front door before turning my attention back to my tasks, though I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. That third night, I arrived at the diner with an unshakable anxiety. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside, heightened my senses as I methodically cleaned tables and swept the floors. For nearly 3 hours, I kept sneaking glances out of the window, half expecting the SUV to appear again. When I finally finished and was about to lock up, I felt an inexplicable chill. I stepped outside into the quiet parking lot, the only sound my own footsteps on the cracked pavement. The street lamps cast long, eerie shadows, and just as I reached the midpoint between the diner and my car, I saw it, a pair of dim headlights emerging from the darkness at the far side of the lot. The SUV was there again, parked in a poorly lit corner away from the comforting glow of the streetlights. In that moment, my instinct screamed to run. Before I could decide what to do, the SUV's engine roared, and it began moving slowly toward me. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my car keys in my pocket. I was only a few feet from my car when the vehicle suddenly halted beside me with a screech of brakes. In the blink of an eye, the passenger door swung open. I didn't have time to process the shock. I just sprinted for my car. As I clambered into my vehicle, I heard the sound of footsteps thudding on the gravel. I glanced in my rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of 3 figures emerging from the shadows, all dressed in dark clothing with their faces obscured by scarves and hoods. They moved with a purpose, closing the distance between us with every passing second. My trembling hands barely managed to start the engine, and I jerked the car into drive, the tires squealing as I tore out of the lot. The figures' shouts and the sound of pounding footsteps faded behind me as I merged onto the main road. I drove in a blur until I reached a well-lit 24-hour gas station. The bright artificial light offered a temporary sense of safety from the darkness that had nearly swallowed me whole. I pulled into a parking spot and immediately dialed 911 as I recounted everything: the SUV, its deliberate appearances, and those masked figures chasing me under the cold night. When the police arrived a short while later, they combed the area and took my statement, but there was little to go on. No security cameras from our diner had caught any clear images, and the SUV had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. The officers could only speculate about what had happened, leaving me with more questions than answers. To this day, I started to avoid the later shifts at the diner, fearing that the SUV or those figures might return. And though I've never seen that SUV or those shadowy figures again, I remain cautious and alert. This all started a few years back when I took a night job at a small 24-hour convenience store called Moonlight Mart. It was a modest little shop tucked away on a quiet side street, the kind of place that rarely saw more than a handful of customers during the witching hours. I'd always preferred the solitude of the night shift, where the silence and the soft hum of refrigerators provided a comforting background. I even lived only a few blocks away, so my walk to and from work was both short and familiar. I remember one chilly autumn night, around 2 a.m., when everything felt especially still. I was behind the counter, idly rearranging some impulse buy items, when I noticed a woman entering the store. She didn't look like a regular customer. There was something almost ethereal about her. She was in her late 30s, with jet black hair that fell in loose waves around her pale face. Dressed in a long, dark coat despite the moderate temperature, she moved with an odd, deliberate grace. After a polite good evening exchanged between us, she drifted off toward the cereal aisle. I couldn't help but notice that her eyes seemed to linger on me a little too long. At first, I assumed she was just lost in thought, but after a few minutes, while I was restocking the counter, I caught sight of her standing partly hidden between the shelves. Clutched in her hand was a small, outdated camcorder, one of those models you'd expect to find in an old thrift store. It looked as if she were recording everything around her, and occasionally, she'd angle it in my direction. I felt a sudden prickling on the back of my neck. The way she held the device, almost reverently, was unsettling. I tried to focus on my tasks, telling myself that maybe she was just an eccentric local blogger. After a few minutes, she seemed to lose interest. I saw her slip behind another aisle, the camcorder clattering softly as she set it aside on a shelf. I let it go, shrugging off the unease. After all, it was just a quiet night, and peculiar behavior wasn't unheard of in a place like this. Time passed and more customers trickled in, mostly late-night wanderers and the occasional insomniac. I barely gave the incident another thought until my shift ended. I locked up, stepped out into the cool darkness, and started the short walk home. The streets were empty, the only sound being the occasional distant hum of a car engine. Yet as I walked, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that someone was watching me. At first, I noticed soft footsteps echoing behind me, but they always seemed too far away to belong to anyone following closely. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder every so often. That's when I saw her again, the same woman, now standing on the opposite sidewalk. She didn't say a word. Instead, she raised the camcorder as if to document my every move. I crossed the street, determined to put as much distance as possible between us. The pursuit felt almost ritualistic. No matter which block I turned, there she was, always a few steps behind, always silent, always recording. By the time I reached the steps of my apartment building, relief washed over me briefly. The building's secure entrance and the heavy door locks gave me a small sense of safety. I fumbled with my keys, anxious to get inside and away from prying eyes. Once inside, I bolted the door and exhaled deeply. Yet sleep did not come easily that night. I kept thinking of the woman's unnerving presence, the persistent clicking of her camcorder's record button echoing in my mind. Eventually, I managed to fall asleep, though the dreams were troubled, filled with shadowy figures and the sound of distant, relentless tapping. The following evening, while I was half awake during a lull in my shift, I heard a faint, almost imperceptible tapping at the back door of the store. My pulse quickened. I crept over to the door and peered through the peephole. For a split second, I thought I saw her, pale, with her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, disappearing into the night. When I looked again, she was gone. I reported the incident to my supervisor the next morning, but nothing concrete ever came of it. The police were notified after I described what I'd experienced on my walk home, yet they couldn't find any trace of her footprints or any evidence that she had ever been there at all. It was as if she was nothing more than a figment of my overactive imagination, or a ghostly reminder that not all watchers have good intentions. I eventually left Moonlight Mart and even moved away from the neighborhood. Years ago, I worked at a 24-hour diner just outside of town. It was one of those places that had been around forever, where truckers, night owls, and the occasional lost traveler would stop in at all hours. The overnight shifts were the worst. Barely any customers, terrible tips, and a lingering unease that never quite went away. I always felt like I was being watched, even when the place was empty. The parking lot lights flickered, the old jukebox sometimes played on its own, and the back storage room always felt colder than it should have been. I hated working alone, so I started asking my friend Matt to come hang out with me. He was one of those guys who never slept and was always up for late-night company. He'd sit at the counter with his laptop, sipping on free coffee while I cleaned and waited for the occasional customer. It made those long, eerie nights a little easier to bear. One Friday night, Matt didn't show. He had texted earlier, saying he'd tried to swing by, but midnight rolled around and I was still alone. Around 2 a.m., I stepped out back for a quick break. The air was thick, heavy, like a storm was coming. When I turned to go back inside, I hesitated. The door was cracked open. I was sure I had closed it behind me. As I stepped inside, glancing around, nothing seemed out of place, but something felt wrong. I told myself I was being paranoid and went back behind the counter to wipe things down. A few minutes later, the bell above the door jingled. I looked up, ready to greet whoever walked in, but no one was there. That's when I noticed it. The bathroom door. It was closed, and the light was on. I knew for a fact that I hadn't seen it like that earlier. The diner had been empty for hours. My pulse quickened. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a metal coffee pot, and slowly walked over. I knocked. Hello, but no answer. I swallowed hard and knocked again. Still nothing. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the air was thick with the scent of something metallic. That's when I saw it. The mirror above the sink was smeared with something dark, thick. Words, scrawled in uneven strokes, I see you. My blood ran cold. A noise behind me, a soft creak. I spun around, expecting someone to be standing there, but there was nothing. Just the empty diner, my own reflection in the mirror. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my phone, my keys, and bolted for the door. As I fumbled with the lock, the bell above the entrance jingled again. The hair on my arms stood on end. I turned just for a second, and I saw him, Matthew, standing by the counter, staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. His eyes were wrong, too wide. His mouth curled into a grin that wasn't his. "Where are you going?" he asked. I didn't answer. I didn't move. He took a step forward, then another. That's when I noticed his shoes. They were wet. I ran. I don't remember unlocking my car. I don't remember starting the engine. I only remember peeling out of that parking lot, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. Matt's number was disconnected the next day. He never answered my texts. He never showed up again. I quit the diner a week later. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't think I ever want to find out.
A little over 3 years ago, I took a job I never expected to have, a night security position at a renovated historic warehouse on the outskirts of town. A friend of mine, Dan, had recommended the gig, saying it was quiet and nothing to worry about. At the time, I was struggling to make ends meet and didn't mind the solitude that came with a midnight shift. I soon learned that quiet sometimes hides the most unsettling secrets. My first night on duty was uneventful enough. The warehouse, now partly converted into a community art space and partly left abandoned, had been outfitted with modern security cameras and a small, glass-enclosed control booth. The large windows overlooked a narrow, poorly lit driveway. I spent the early hours reviewing feeds of the empty lot and echoing corridors, the only sounds being the hum of machinery and the occasional creak from the old building settling into the night. At roughly 1:20 a.m., while scanning a feed from the main entrance, I noticed a figure moving in the periphery. A tall man wearing a dark, threadbare coat and a battered fedora that shadowed most of his face. His gait was measured, almost rehearsed, as if he were following a predetermined path. I leaned forward and tried to focus the camera, but the low light rendered his features indistinct. "Security to main entrance," I announced over the intercom in a cautious tone. There was no immediate response, just a moment of static and the distant rustle of wind through dead branches. I kept watching as the man slowly approached the glass door. The door, designed to slide open automatically with motion, swung open with a soft whoosh, and the man stepped inside. I switched to the interior camera. The lobby was dimly lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs, and a thin layer of dust covered the old mosaic floor. The man walked confidently across the space, his eyes occasionally darting toward the corridor as if he were searching for something or someone. Gathering my nerve, I greeted him through the speaker. "Good evening. How can I help you?" In response, the man paused, turning slowly to face the camera. His voice was low and deliberate. "I'm looking for Suite 12. I seem to have misplaced my access pass." There was something off about his tone, a mix of urgency and calm that sent an inexplicable chill down my spine. I hesitated, as I recalled that the building's new section was strictly for scheduled guests and events. A quick check in the digital log confirmed there was no reservation under his name for Suite 12. "Suite 12 is currently unoccupied," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "May I ask for some identification?" He smirked. the corners of his lips curling in a way that made my skin crawl. "I know what I need. Just allow me in," he insisted. I felt the weight of the building's strict security protocols pressing down on me, but something in his expression told me this wasn't a normal inquiry. I pressed the intercom button again. "Sir, I'm afraid I can't grant access without proper verification. Please wait in the lobby." After a tense silence, I heard his heavy footsteps echo away toward a side hallway. Relieved yet still unnerved, I returned to monitoring the cameras, only to find that the man had reappeared in a different part of the building. This time, he was near a long corridor lined with old ornate mirrors that had survived the renovation. In one of the reflections, I distinctly saw not just the man, but another shadowy figure standing directly behind him, a gaunt, almost translucent presence that vanished when I quickly shifted my gaze. My heart pounded as I reached for my cell phone to call Dan for advice, but the call went straight to voicemail. I could almost hear my own breathing echoing in the silence of the booth. The security system, which I assumed was foolproof, suddenly began glitching. Cameras flickered, and digital displays froze intermittently. I tried to maintain control of the situation, reminding myself that it was probably just a technical hiccup. Before I could regain composure, I heard muffled voices and the sound of heavy footsteps coming from the corridor outside the control booth. The intercom crackled to life with a distorted, low command, "Let me in now." My hands trembled as I fumbled with the lock controls. I could hear the man's measured steps growing nearer, his voice morphing into an unintelligible murmur punctuated by sharp, almost animalistic hisses. I bolted the security door as best as I could, feeling trapped in a slowly closing cage. Every shadow on the walls seemed to twitch and move, as if imbued with a life of its own. Desperation surged through me. I had to get help. I dialed 911, my voice barely above a whisper, as I described the bizarre intruder and the malfunctioning security system. The dispatcher's calm tone did little to ease my mounting fear, and I was told that officers would be dispatched immediately. Minutes, or perhaps it was hours, stretched by as I sat locked inside the booth. I could still hear footsteps pacing outside, and every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of that unnerving figure through a small viewing window. His eyes, when illuminated by the flickering lights, seemed almost to glow with a predatory intensity. At one point, I even heard him softly whisper, "You can't hide forever," as if speaking directly to me. Eventually, the sound of approaching sirens shattered the oppressive silence. I unlocked the booth and rushed out into the lobby, where 2 officers were already methodically sweeping the area. I described the intruder, the glitching cameras, and even mentioned the bizarre figure in the mirror. The officers exchanged skeptical looks but promised to investigate every corner of the building. After a thorough search, they found no trace of the man or the strange apparition that had haunted my night. Only a few scattered items, oddly arranged near the old mirror, remained as evidence of his presence. One officer quietly mentioned that there had been local legends about the warehouse being a nexus for unexplained phenomena. But I wasn't ready to entertain ghost stories. The incident left me shaken to my core. I resigned from the job shortly afterward, unable to shake the feeling that something unnatural had crossed the threshold of that building. I learned that sometimes the rules and protocols meant to protect us fail when confronted with forces beyond our understanding. I've spent nearly 15 years patrolling the quiet grounds of an old industrial complex on the edge of town. Most nights, my shift passed without incident, just routine checks, locked gates, and the occasional stray animal rummaging through discarded boxes. I'd grown accustomed to the solitude and the creaks of metal under the cool night air, confident in my ability to handle whatever might come my way. But one bitter autumn night, everything changed. The property was a maze of abandoned warehouses and unused loading docks, all relics of a time when the complex thrived. Now, under a thin crescent moon, the sprawling site lay silent, except for the whisper of the wind. As I made my usual rounds, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, I took note of every rusted bolt and every echoing footstep of my own. It was a routine check until I reached the far side of the compound, a row of chain-link fences bordering a derelict maintenance building. That's when I noticed it. One section of the fence was slightly askew, the metal links twisted as if someone had pried them open. I paused, my skin prickling despite the chilly air. The damage was fresh, the rust along the torn edge glistening under my beam. I jotted down the anomaly in my log, attributing it to local kids or vandals at first, though a sense of unease crept in. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. About an hour later, as I strolled past a stack of dusty shipping containers near the old boiler room, I caught a glimpse of movement. At first, it was just a flicker of a dark silhouette darting between containers. I called out firmly, "This area is off limits. Identify yourself." But the figure made no sound, only a slow, deliberate shift into the shadows. I edged closer, my heart pounding until the light of my flashlight revealed nothing but empty space and scattered debris. Perplexed, I bent down near where the figure had vanished. There, half buried in damp leaves, lay a battered flashlight, one that wasn't mine, and a pair of heavy-duty pliers that looked far too robust for any casual repair job. The pliers' steel was cold and slick with oil, a stark contrast to the worn plastic of the flashlight. I radioed in the discovery, my voice steady despite the churning in my chest. The supervisor on the other end advised caution and instructed me to keep watch for any further disturbances. For the remainder of the shift, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Every creak of metal, every gust of wind through the broken windows of the warehouses made me spin around in the dark. When my shift ended, I locked up the main building and reluctantly headed to the guard's booth, all the while wondering if I'd caught only a glimpse of a prowler or something far more sinister. The following nights, things began to escalate. Tools from the storage shed started disappearing. Wrenches, hammers, even a length of crowbar. I'd find traces of activity too. Muddy footprints near the loading docks. A trail of discarded cigarette butts leading to an unused service door. One particularly foggy night, while making my rounds near the central office building, I saw what I can only describe as a shadow flitting across the glass windows. I paused in my tracks and listened for any sounds, but aside from my own heavy breathing, the silence was absolute. On the fourth night, around 2:30 a.m., I decided I had to take matters into my own hands. I set up a discreet motion sensor by the rusted service door, a place where I had repeatedly seen evidence of tampering, and positioned myself in a concealed alcove behind a stack of old pallets. I kept my flashlight low, barely illuminating my surroundings, trying to become part of the darkness. The sensor's quiet beep suddenly shattered the silence. I edged forward, each step measured and silent, until I reached the doorway. There, illuminated by the narrow beam of my flashlight, stood the same dark figure I'd seen before. This time, the intruder was crouched next to an open tool locker, as if searching for something. I didn't shout immediately. Instead, I advanced slowly, my hand hovering near the holster of my pepper spray. "Freeze," I managed to hiss, flipping on my flashlight in one swift motion. The figure jerked upright, startled, and for a split second, our eyes locked. In that moment, I saw nothing but a void of malice and desperation behind the shadow of a worn hoodie. Before I could get a clear look at their face, the intruder bolted, vanishing into the maze of containers and abandoned structures. I gave chase for a few desperate minutes, but the sprawling property swallowed them up. All that remained was a small, rusted key left behind on the cold concrete, glinting oddly under the harsh light. I immediately contacted the police. They arrived swiftly, combing the area with searchlights that cut through the darkness. Despite their thorough search, they only found the key and no trace of the mysterious trespasser. The officers took the key as evidence and promised to increase patrols in the area, but the unease that had settled in my chest was far from lifted. In the days that followed, my nights grew even more restless. With the discovery of the intruder's items and the bizarre incidents on the property, my supervisor decided to upgrade security. Surveillance cameras were installed at key points along the perimeter, and an extra guard was scheduled for the midnight shift. Still, every night I'd lie awake, the memory of that cold stare haunting me, the image of those gloved hands rifling through the locker imprinted in my mind. Now every shift feels different. I still remember my first part-time gig, delivering pizzas for a rundown local joint, back in 2012. It was the kind of job that paid decently for fast-paced, adrenaline-fueled nights, and on one particular foggy Friday, I was about to learn that some deliveries were best left undisturbed. That night, the pizzeria was nearly empty except for the two of us on delivery duty, and our manager, a no-nonsense sort with a penchant for punctuality, stressed that every minute counted before closing. Our next order came through from an address on the far side of town, a sprawling, decrepit house on a narrow, poorly lit road, flanked by gnarled trees. The order itself was simple enough: a large meat lover's pizza, paired with a side of garlic knots. I knew longer trips usually meant heftier tips, so despite my unease, I set off without hesitation. After a winding drive through unfamiliar streets, I finally pulled up in front of the dilapidated house. Its paint was peeling, the yard was overgrown, and a rusted chain-link fence barely held back nature's reclaiming grip. Before I even stepped out of my car, something caught my eye. In a broken, grimy window near the second floor, I thought I saw a fleeting glimpse of a face, a pair of eyes half hidden in the dark, watching me. Trying to shake off the sudden chill, I stepped out with the pizza bag tucked under my arm. The front door was slightly ajar, and as I approached it, I noticed a crumpled note stuck to the doorframe in hurried, almost desperate handwriting. It read, "Latch broken. Please slip inside quietly. Money on the counter. Do not knock." My heart pounded as I considered the implications. The note was bizarre, almost as if its author expected unwanted company. I hesitated for a split second before pushing the door open. It creaked loudly in the oppressive silence that greeted me. Inside, darkness swallowed every detail, until I fumbled for my phone and switched on its flashlight. The beam revealed a narrow hallway lined with faded, peeling wallpaper and a thin layer of dust on the creaking wooden floor. I moved cautiously, every footstep echoing through the empty space. There was no sign of life, no warmth, just the persistent feeling that something unseen lurked just out of sight. I followed the narrow corridor to what I presumed was a small dining area, where an old wooden table sat beneath a single flickering overhead light. There, neatly arranged as promised by the note, was a modest stack of cash. My hands trembled slightly as I picked it up. Something about the whole situation felt off, as if the promise of easy money came at a hidden price. Before I could even pocket the money, I thought I heard a soft shuffle from the far corner of the room. I spun around, my light darting over shadows and half-forgotten furniture, when suddenly I caught sight of a dark silhouette standing motionless near a closed door. For a heartbeat, I could make out a pair of hollow eyes fixed on me, as if the figure was silently appraising my intrusion. The stillness of the moment was shattered by the pounding of my own heart, and instinct took over. Grabbing the pizza bag and the cash, I bolted toward the exit. I didn't pause to look back as I slammed the door behind me, racing back to my car with a single desperate thought: get out. The drive away was a blur, but every so often a nagging sensation told me I wasn't truly alone. It felt as though unseen eyes were tracking my escape, following every turn of the road. That night, safe in my apartment, sleep was elusive. Every creak of the floorboards and every whisper of the wind brought the memory of that eerie delivery flooding back. I never did figure out who, or what, had left that frantic note, or whether the silent watcher in the darkness was human at all. One thing was clear: sometimes the most routine jobs can lead you straight into the kind of nightmare you'd only ever expect to see in movies. I've never dared venture back to that part of town, and every time I see a delivery bag or hear the chime of my phone, I'm reminded of that unsettling night. A reminder that not all money is worth the risk, and that sometimes it's best to leave mysteries in the dark.